Well, good morning, everybody. As Stephen White just said, the subject of this morning's, this particular conference or section is the role of power and clericalism in the crisis. Two views. My name is Chris Ruddy. I teach systematic theology here at Catholic University. I'll be moderating this session. Each of our two presenters will give his paper, and then afterwards we will have time for questions, discussions of those papers afterwards. Our first speaker is Richard Gaillardetz, the Joseph Professor of Catholic Systematic Theology and the chair of the BC Theology Department, Boston College Theology Department. He previously taught at the University of Toledo from 2001 to 2011 as a Thomas and Margaret Murray and James Bassick Professor of Catholic Studies, and at the University of St. Thomas Graduate School of Theology in Houston from 1991 to 2001. He earned his doctorate in systematic theology from the University of Notre Dame. A past president of the Catholic Theological Society of America, he has published numerous professional and popular articles and has authored or edited 13 books on such topics as church authority, ecclesiology, the Second Vatican Council, marriage and family life, and Pope Francis. He is currently editing the Cambridge Companion to Vatican II, which hopefully will be published in early 2020. As you may gather from these accomplishments, Dr. Gaillardetz is not a lazy man. In addition, he and his wife, Diana, are the parents of 4 young men, David, Andrew, Brian, and Gregory. Please welcome Professor Gaillardetz.
Good morning. Let me begin by acknowledging how honored I am by the invitation to participate in this event, even as I'm saddened by the current crisis in our church that makes such an event a necessity. I don't believe it's necessary for me to outline the contours of our current crisis. You wouldn't be here if you were not already well familiar with the many horrific accounts of clerical sexual abuse perpetrated on the most vulnerable, and the shocking revelations of episcopal complicity and cover-up. We've already encountered in our church a wide range of responses to this crisis, and more will doubtless be offered today. Yet in the midst of many calls for a new commitment to policing, investigation, transparent reporting that holds perpetrators accountable, I'm convinced that we must pursue a more probing analysis into the deeper causes of this crisis. In his September 2018 letter to the people of God, Pope Francis identified the evil of clericalism as a principal cause of our crisis. Francis had already, on previous occasions, denounced clericalism, which he has defined as an attitude marked by a sense of ministerial superiority and a failure to remain close to the people one serves. Soon after the appearance of the Pope's letter, Bishop Vincent Long of Parramatta, Australia, warned, however, against imagining clericalism simply as an attitude manifested by certain individuals. Rather, he insisted, it is a question of clericalism inherent in the very culture of the church, unquote. His employment of the term culture is worth exploring further. According to sociologist and ecclesiologist George Wilson, speaking of a clerical culture suggests, quote, very concrete patterns of behavior and ways of thinking that operate at a largely unconscious or unexamined level. For those immersed in such a culture, one's basic values, attitudes, presuppositions, and actions may seem entirely ordinary and comprehensible. Yet for those who do not belong to that culture, those same actions may seem deeply troubling and even offensive. It is a culture, the participation in which many clergy may be largely unaware, particularly to the extent that they are surrounded primarily by those who participate in that culture. Moreover, this clerical culture is not limited to the clergy themselves. To the extent that the laity share the same cultural presuppositions, that is, to the extent that we willfully accede to clerical claims to privilege and uncritical deference, we help sustain that culture, rendering many of its most problematic features invisible. Now, the existence of clericalism, it is worth pointing out, is not indicated by the mere presence of a clergy. The term clergy or cleric, frankly, although it has canonical standing, is not a term with a great deal of ecclesiological value. As a sociological category, clergy simply refers to a subgroup in the church identified by specialized knowledge and professional competencies. And in any organization as vast and differentiated as the Catholic Church, it's hard to imagine there not being some kind of clergy. However, we begin to encounter clericalism when basic and necessary ministerial distinctions are hardened into a caste-like separation marked by privilege, uncritical deference, and dominating power with respect to the lay faithful. What are some indications of this clerical culture? First, we can see it in a persistent preoccupation with the maintenance of a distinct clerical identity, an inordinate fascination with clerical garb and titles, which is not to be confused with a practical recognition that some of these things have a real value. Often, this preoccupation with clerical identity comes at the expense of a sense of solidarity with the whole people of God. We can also see a sign of this clerical culture manifested in a problematic and reductive theology of the ministerial priesthood. Such a theology fails to properly correlate the ministerial priesthood to the service of the baptismal priesthood. It relies on an exaggerated, atomistic, and hyper-interiorized account of the sacramental character conferred at ordination. It tends to focus on the conferral of new powers, as in the power to confect the Eucharist and absolve sins, but stripped of any substantive ecclesial reference. Moreover, this reductive theology of the priesthood, as opposed to a healthy, authentic one, faithful to the best instincts of our tradition, which I will get to in a moment, this reductive theology of the priesthood presumes a more privatized account of priestly vocation, moving too easily from a sense of God's call to the individual's acceptance of that call, while overlooking the necessary mediating role of the church as the context in which that call is to be discerned, assessed, and cultivated. A second indication of clericalism is the sense of being exempt from criticism or accountability by those outside the clerical guild. The canonist John Beale writes, and I quote, "Since all lines of accountability point upward in canon law, only hierarchical superiors are competent to judge whether their subordinates have adequately fulfilled the obligations of their offices or abused their powers. Bishops, pastors, and other office holders are accountable for their stewardship to those who appointed them, not to those they serve. The faithful may express disgruntlement about the shoddy performance, nonfeasance, and malfeasance of their pastors and even bishops to their hierarchical superiors. But superiors are free to give these complaints as much or as little weight as their discretion dictates when deciding whether to retain, remove, or discipline their subordinates." Unquote. A third sign of a persistent clerical culture lies in the instinct of the clergy to protect the good reputation of their guild at all costs. This is often justified by a sense that those outside the guild cannot properly appreciate the demands and expectations placed on those within the guild. Finally, while a balanced ecclesiology will acknowledge the diversity of roles and ministries in the life of the church, clericalism will redeploy these distinctions to justify a hierarchical superiority, the exercise of dominating power, and the expectation of uncritical deference. Now, although we may be tempted to limit our attention to the ministerial priesthood, the seeds of clericalism lie just as much in the current theology, structures, and practices associated with the episcopate. One of the unfortunate ambiguities of the Second Vatican Council's teaching on the ministry of the bishop concerned whether one should situate the bishop first in terms of his relationship to the entire College of Bishops with the Pope as its head, or in relation to his local church. There are conciliar passages that can be found in support of both tendencies. Yet today, church law and custom continue to accentuate the bishop's relationship to the Episcopal College as a whole, and the Pope in particular, and to attenuate his relationship to his flock. Here again, we see one of the features of a clerical culture, an emphasis on belonging to an elite group, in this case the Episcopal College, and a weakened sense of solidarity with and accountability to those they would serve. Consider that approximately 40% of today's bishops, including ordained church diplomats, many Vatican bureaucrats, and every auxiliary bishop, is assigned to a titular see. That is, they are made bishop of a diocese that once existed but no longer does today. So technically, every bishop is ordained to serve a local church, even if that church possesses no living members. How can such a custom not trivialize the bishop's relationship to the local church? We must consider as well that since the 19th century, it has been the practice of the Vatican to appoint bishops to dioceses with minimal input from the local churches themselves. Add to this the fact that bishops today are frequently transferred from one diocese to another, often as a form of ecclesiastical promotion from seemingly peripheral pastoral assignments to more prestigious sees. Finally, consider the use of lofty forms which still occurs in some contexts. Forms of address directed to bishops, Your Excellency, toward archbishops, Your Grace, toward cardinals, Your Eminence, or the fact that cardinals are still referred to in many quarters as princes of the church. All of these structures and practices have played a role in sustaining an entrenched clerical culture. So how do we move forward to the path of reform? Let me first address the priesthood before turning once more to the episcopate and recognizing that time prohibits me from engaging other spheres in church life where clericalism manifests itself, including among the laity. One antidote to the scourge of clericalism would be the widespread embrace, particularly in seminary education, of a more sound theology of the ministerial priesthood. Such a theology would take inspiration from the teaching of the council, which presented a kind of analogical order to our understanding of the priesthood, one which begins, of course, as it must, with the one and utterly unique priesthood of Christ. From there, we recognize the way in which all the baptized, not just the laity, all the baptized participate in Christ's priesthood. And finally, we acknowledge the ministerial or ordained priesthood, which exists to serve the priesthood of all believers. Indeed, although it was not consistently developed, one of the most helpful contributions of the council was its emphasis on the need for the ordained to identify, support, empower, and order the many charisms of the baptized. A sound theology of the ministerial priesthood would recognize that ordination is not, in the first instance, about simply the conferral of special powers. Rather, ordination draws the ordinand into a new relationship with Christ and Christ's church sent in mission. The empowerment that ordination effects does not precede, but rather follows from the ordinand's sacramental configuration to Christ and his church. This is why I believe the council chose not to make use of the more static notion of the priest as an alter Christus, another Christ. Rather, the council employed the more dynamic and relational language, noting the priest is ordained in persona Christi capitis, in the person of Christ the head. By baptism, of course, all of us are called to live in persona Christi. The priest is ordained into a distinctive relationship to Christ's body, the church. It is a relationship of headship, yes, but not conceived hierarchically as that term is popularly understood, but according to a leadership of service. The priest is head precisely as Christ is head, not as one to be served, but as one called to serve, not as one whose feet should be washed, but as one who washes the feet of others. As Pope Francis has noted, at the heart of clericalism is an inability to be close to and walk with those one is called to serve. A more adequate theology of the ministerial priesthood should, in turn, inform how our church calls forth candidates for priestly formation. If we are to purge the church of clericalism, we must reassess our traditional criteria for suitability to priestly ministry. Personal holiness, for example, remains a necessary but not sufficient condition for priestly ordination. We need holy priests, to be sure, but we also need healthy ones. And an even cursory history of our tradition affirms that these two things, holiness and health, do not always come together. One of Pope St. John Paul II's most important contributions to priestly formation was his stress on the need for healthy human development. It should now be painfully clear to us that the lack of a healthy psychosexual maturity and the attendant tendencies towards sexual repression and or self-deception have helped create conditions ripe for inappropriate clerical behavior. The psychosexually immature candidate is likely to be attracted to an insular clerical culture precisely because the uncritical deference that such a culture encourages could allow him to avoid healthy, vulnerable, accountable relationships. Now, it's important to add, given the cultural tendency to pathologize celibacy, we must emphasize it is psychosexual immaturity that lies at the heart of clerical sexual abuse, not one's status as celibate or married. At the same time, we must acknowledge that priestly celibacy, which has long been central to our Catholic tradition, is engaged most authentically when it is recognized as a charism to be lived faithfully by the psychosexually mature rather than a requirement imposed by law on those who may be called to priestly ministry but who do not recognize in themselves the charism for celibacy. When celibacy is imposed by burden of law, rather than embraced as an authentic gift, psychic and affective mechanisms may develop for coping with that burden that can lead to immature interpersonal relationships and an inability to develop authentic intimacy with others. Finally, we should seek out candidates who are eager collaborators in ministry, candidates who delight in identifying and supporting the gifts of others. To be blunt, our current system is often better equipped to identify impediments to ordination than to recognize and cultivate authentic charisms for pastoral leadership. Concerns regarding the identification of candidates for ordination naturally leads to concern regarding the context and process of priestly formation itself. If the ministerial priesthood exists to empower all God's people for their missionary task, and here I'm thinking primarily, I should point out, of a diocesan priesthood, then it does not seem to make a lot of sense to prepare diocesan priests in quasi-monastic seclusion separated from worldly realities and concerns. How healthy is it for seminarians to be insulated from the everyday realities of family budgeting, shopping, cooking, and doing laundry? Indeed, it is shocking to consider how little of the structure and context of priestly formation has changed since the establishment of our current seminary system at the 16th century Council of Trent. Seminarians should be expected to pursue their studies in academic contexts where they'll be accompanied by laymen and women as students, and where they would be taught by a diversity of professors, lay and ordained men and women. Might the time have even come to experiment with housing candidates for diocesan priesthood for at least a significant portion of their formation in parish rectories? Such formation would transpire under dedicated pastoral mentorship and in daily living and ministerial contexts, much closer to those in which they will live and minister for the majority of their priestly careers. All of these proposals have as their aim a practice of priestly formation that moves away from a stress on privileged separateness while encouraging gospel practices of pastoral accompaniment and solidarity with those whom they are ordained to serve. As I've already noted, the clerical culture which pervades our church is sustained not only by problematic theologies and practices associated with the priesthood, but also with the episcopate. The structural weakening of the bishop's relationship with his local church is a significant factor in the perpetuation of a clerical culture. In the church of the first 4 centuries, the bishop's relationship to his local church was maintained by much deeper and more profound solidaristic bonds with the local church than are present today. For example, one of the most widely shared convictions of early Christianity concerned the right of the local church to affirm, either by election or acclamation, the appointment of their bishop. St. Cyprian, the 3rd century bishop of Carthage, wrote, and I quote, "Moreover, we can see that divine authority is also the source for the practice whereby bishops are chosen in the presence of the laity and before the eyes of all, and they are judged as being suitable and worthy after public scrutiny and testimony," unquote. The 4th century sees the beginning of a shift away from lay participation in favor of the role of local clergy in the election of bishops. Yet the principle remained that at minimum, the laity could block the appointment of a bishop they did not want. And so Pope Celestine I would declare in the early 5th century, and I quote, "Let a bishop not be imposed upon the people whom they do not want," unquote. Pope Leo the Great would further insist, quote, "He who has to preside over all must be elected by all," unquote. In contrast to this ancient practice, procedures in the 1983 Code of Canon Law provide for little input from the local church. In the current code, the laity's role in the selection of bishop is reduced to selective consultation, left to the discretion of the papal legate. One obvious reform would be to develop revised procedures that give local churches greater say in the selection of their local bishop. I am not proposing one ballot per person elections. Such a solution would doubtless succumb to our current hyper-polarized and partisan culture. However, one could easily draw from the centuries of experience among consecrated religious men's and women's communities who have developed proven methods for ecclesial discernment in the election of their leaders. Many of the procedures that have been developed for convening diocesan synods could be adapted in like manner. A second proposal would return to the early church's tendency against the conferral of titular sees, that is, the practice of ordaining a bishop and assigning him a pastoral charge of a non-existent local church. Prohibiting this common practice would help subvert the sense of episcopal ordination as an honorific or ecclesiastical promotion. Episcopal ordination in our Catholic tradition constitutes a call to a specific form of pastoral leadership over a local flock, no more and no less. The Church would also do well to reinstitute, with prudent modifications, the ancient canonical prohibition against the translation of a bishop, that is, the transfer of a bishop from one diocese to another. Occasional exceptions to this canon were made in the early church, but they were rare. There were good theological and pastoral reasons for this prohibition. The transfer of a bishop violated the nuptial symbolism of a bishop's marriage to his people, a symbol reinforced in the modern ritual by the newly ordained bishop's investiture with an episcopal ring. At a pastoral level, the prohibition also helped forestall episcopal careerism. As Michael Buckley observed, quote, "The early church saw quite practically in this effort to move from one see to another an endless source of clerical ambition, rivalry, and self-promotion," unquote. If a bishop of a relatively small diocese has aspirations for promotion to a larger and more significant church, he may be more inclined to act cautiously, concerned with how his actions might be interpreted by those with the authority to assign him to a more influential post. By contrast, a bishop who has been embraced by his local church and considers himself married to his flock, however modest, is more inclined to keep the concerns of his people foremost in mind. Finally, a comprehensive challenge to the culture of clericalism must apply Pope Francis's principle of synodality all the way down. Prayerful listening to the laity by bishops and all clergy, while necessary, is not sufficient if we are really intent on breaking up the clerical sedimentation that exists in our church. Or, to transpose metaphors, we cannot pour the new wine of ecclesial synodality into the old wineskins of canonical structures still tainted by clerical privilege. What is needed is a richer culture of collaboration in church governance at all levels. Certainly there are quasi-synodal institutions currently available in canon law that hold promise, such as pastoral and diocesan councils, diocesan synods, and plenary councils like the one currently being planned in the Church of Australia. If diocesan synods and provincial or plenary councils are to be effective instruments of synodality, however, we must dramatically expand lay participation and provide deliberative and not merely consultative vote for lay participants. New institutional structures beyond those currently available in canon law must also be developed that draw the laity into a fuller participation in the governance of the church without compromising the distinctive apostolic oversight of the Pope and bishops. Let me bring these reflections to a close by invoking one of the lesser-known events associated with the Second Vatican Council. Throughout the course of the council, a number of bishops were moved by Pope St. John XXIII's evocation of a Church of the Poor. And so they began meeting at the Belgian College in Rome while the council was in session. These bishops had become persuaded of the need to engage in a more evangelical ministry, one inspired by direct gospel imperatives. And in the fall of 1965, as the council was drawing to a close, some 40 bishops gathered quietly in the Domitilla catacombs outside of Rome, where they celebrated the Eucharist and signed a pact which would come to be known as the Pact of the Catacombs. This remarkable pact included the following pledge, which I excerpt. We bishops, assembled in the Second Vatican Council, are conscious of the deficiencies of our lifestyle in terms of evangelical poverty, motivated by one another. We will try to live according to the ordinary manner of our people in all that concerns housing, food, means of transport, and related matters. We do not want to be addressed verbally or in writing with names and titles that express prominence and power, such as eminence, excellency, lordship. In our communications and social relations, we will avoid everything that may appear as a concession of privilege, prominence, or preference to the wealthy or the powerful. Accordingly, we will make an effort to review our lives. We will seek collaborators in ministry so that we can be animators according to the Spirit rather than dominators according to the world. We will try to make ourselves as humanly present and welcoming as possible. And we will show ourselves to be open to all, no matter what their beliefs. May God help us to be faithful." Unquote. If we are to succeed in purging our church of the scourge of clericalism, we will need church leaders prepared to enter into the spirit of this historic pledge. But it will also require that we, the lay faithful, enter into our own review of our lives, mindful of the ways that we too have been complicit in the rampant clericalism in our church. For none of us is exempt from the call to conversion that authentic Christian discipleship requires. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gaillardetz, for that paper. Our second speaker this morning is Dr. Chad Pecknold. He received his PhD from the University of Cambridge, and since 2008 has been teaching systematic theology here at the Catholic University of America. His areas of specialization are fundamental theology, Christian anthropology, and political theology. He is the author of a number of scholarly articles and books, including most recently, Christianity and Politics, A Brief Guide to History, Cascade 2010, and the T&T Clark Companion to Augustine and Modern Theology, Bloomsbury 2014. He is a frequent contributor to debates in the public square, writing regular columns for First Things and National Review on a range of topics related to the importance and impact of church teaching on social and political questions. A self-described Augustinian Thomist, he is an associate editor for the journal Nova et Vetera and co-edits with Father Thomas Joseph White the new Sacra Doctrina series at the Catholic University of America Press. He is presently writing a book, which will hopefully be out next year, entitled The City of God in America, which looks at Augustine's classic work for the light that it sheds on the place of the Catholic Church in the American Republic. He and his wife Sarah are the parents of 3 children, Will, Kate, and Jack. Please welcome Professor Pecknold.
The 20th century was a brutal one. Men bore the brutality in a particular way. They not only bore the brunt of 2 world wars and other bloody conflicts, but they saw the alienation of fathers from their families and the advance of contraceptive technology, making it possible for them to detach sex from marriage and to disorient their natural urge to become fathers. Today, we have a crisis of natural fatherhood reaching epic proportion. Many today would say that a child does not need a father, or that a child can flourish just as well without one. The father seems like an accoutrement that is chosen, or who chooses by capricious acts of desire. The scholarly research on fatherhood runs counter to all this. The social consequences of the crisis of natural fatherhood is by now well established. The wound of fatherlessness that President Obama spoke about has profound consequences for how human beings relate, understand, and trust one another. The same crisis is now visible to us in the sacramental order of fathers under the term clericalism. What is clericalism? It is a relatively new word. People mean by it various things. It's not hard to imagine that word on the lips of 18th century French revolutionaries who wanted to remove priests and bishops from public life entirely. When some hear clericalism, they hear what is, in fact, anti-clericalism. Today, in places like California, legislators want to pass absurd laws that compel priests to break the seal of confession. In Australia, we see a frenzied anti-clericalism, intent on destroying innocent bishops as scapegoats for crimes committed by others. Surely, this is not what is meant by clericalism. Pope Francis has identified clericalism as an illness in the Church. It is a certain kind of deference, perhaps, that gives priests something like capricious sovereignty over body and spirit, and which sets them apart from the rule of faith by which the laity are expected to live. Whether he rails against airport bishops or praises shepherds who have the smell of their sheep, Pope Francis has long emphasized the need for the priest to be a father and not an executive. In a letter to all Catholics after the Pennsylvania grand jury report, the Holy Father said, "To say no to abuse is to say an emphatic no to all forms of clericalism." But he cannot mean by clericalism some kind of anti-clericalism. Rather, I think it is closer to the truth to say that he sees the illness as something more interior, an interior breach of the relationship that fathers are to have with their children. The Holy Father indicates this well when he associates clericalism with another illness he frequently names needing treatment in the field hospital, namely narcissism. Narcissism is a kind of inward turn that happens in the interior life of a father, and of course others, which can have devastating repercussions on the children. Clericalism, on this definition, allied with narcissism, might point us to deeper, disordered dispositions in the interior recesses of the souls of some sacramental fathers as well as natural, dispositions in which the image of God gets curved in upon the self. Thus, I think we can speak about clericalism not simply as a problem with hierarchical order or power or privilege, or as a kind of omerta that keeps secrets among a family of sexual sinners. It may be some or all of those things. But I think if we want to get to the theological roots of the crisis, we should attend to clericalism as an illness deriving from an interior deformation that alienates men from their heavenly Father and disorders the way they see the image of God in the mirror and also in the pews of praise, which they sometimes mistake for a mirror. Put simply, we must not think about clericalism simply as an illness of power, lest we be overcome by the temptation to think that everything can be understood in terms of power rather than in terms of the truth about God. My central thesis this morning is that clericalism is not simply a crisis of power, but of spiritual paternity. It is a crisis that has no other cause than that absurd privative turn away from the face of the Father. My aim this morning is to look at three developments in modern theology that coincide with the years of abuse. I do not mean to suggest that modern theological developments or even deformations are causal of sexual abuse. In fact, I do not think clericalism is itself a causal explanation. At best, the law of iniquity is a quasi-law that follows no direct lines and admits to no easy explanations. Yet clericalism is a decent correlative explanation that deserves to have its depth sounded. Rather, I want to look this morning at how shifts in how theologians have thought about God in the 20th century, how they've thought about morality, and how they've thought about liturgy have either helped or hindered a turn away from the Father that is so evident in culture and also in instances of clerical abuse. Each turn tells us something important about how our crisis is rooted in the formation of the Imago Dei, how the image is formed or deformed in us, especially in how we see God, how we imagine him, how we imitate and worship him, and how our vision of the Father may form or deform us, depending on what we see. Since, as Aquinas teaches, human fathers are only fathers by analogy to God the Father, it follows that the corruption of the fathers is itself rooted not so much in power, but at its depth is rooted in the primal turn away from the primary analogate, God. So first, God. First things first. We must examine how theological vision can change almost without us noticing. Pope Benedict in his Regensburg address attacked the voluntarist and nominalist turn away from the Father, which he saw at the root of a kind of radical skepticism he saw gripping atheistic visions of the university. The address was controversial at the time for the simple reason that he identified a theological problem in Islamic thought that was analogous to a theological problem in Catholic thought. He turned to a 14th century dialogue between a Byzantine Catholic emperor and an Islamic thinker from Persia. The emperor argues forcefully that spreading faith through violence is irrational and that not acting rationally is contrary to God's nature. To the well-read emperor, metaphysics and as well as revelation teaches us that God acts in accord with his nature, which is good. And his nature is supremely intelligible as the uncaused cause of all reality. Genuine faith will be turned towards this intelligibility. It will be a reasonable faith. But the Muslim interlocutor is recorded as saying that God is not bound even by his own word, and that nothing would oblige him to reveal the truth to us. Were it God's will, we would even have to practice idolatry. It's a pity that many heard in that something against Islam, because what Benedict was really targeting was a metaphysical shift that had happened in certain strands of Catholic thought. A few paragraphs later, Benedict writes, in contrast with the so-called intellectualism of Augustine and Thomas, there arose a voluntarism which in its later developments led to claim that we can only know God's voluntas ordinata. Beyond this is the realm of God's freedom, in virtue of which we could have done the opposite of everything he has actually done. Benedict writes, this gives rise to positions which clearly approach the image of a capricious God who is not even bound to truth and goodness. God's transcendence and otherness, Benedict writes, are exalted in such a way apart from reason, apart from what is true and good. These are no longer an authentic, reliable mirror of God, whose deepest possibilities remain eternally unattainable and hidden behind his actual decisions, end quote. The Father's commands may be contrary to everything you know to be reasonable in this framework. The Father's commands can be contrary to what you know to be true and good, but which you obey and feel powerless before, because what else is there? And that kind of divine clericalism would be abusive. Benedict's response, of course, is to propose the loving Father who acts only in accord with his nature. In a sense, Deus caritas est is Benedict's response to this malignant trend. However, Benedict neglects something like the inverted twin of this capricious God, and this is something which hits the 20th century squarely. On the flip side of Enlightenment skepticism about our ability to know God by reason is a projectionist tendency to turn theology into anthropology, to project our suffering onto God. In the midst of the 20th century, after the Shoah, after 2 world wars, so much brutality, so much suffering, the West looked for a therapeutic vision and found it in a vision of the Father not as utterly distant and capricious, but so intimately bound up with our suffering that he can be said even to need our suffering in order to be the Father. This is not, strictly speaking, a response to nominalism or voluntarism, but certain philosophical responses to the Enlightenment, such as Hegel, Schelling, Feuerbach, Schleiermacher, and others, who tend towards something like the inverse theological vision. Hegel, for example, does not see God as the true font of light and wisdom and the primal origin raised high beyond all things, to borrow from Thomas. Because in the most dramatic way possible, Hegel believes, and I quote, that God is not God without the world. For Hegel, the absolute or universal chooses to move out of itself to the historically particular, a kenotic movement which non-identically recurs as God pours out his divine love and mercy into a common life of Geist or spirit, which must be represented by cult and sacrifice, by a sexuality, moral community. Citing a Lutheran hymn, God himself is dead, Hegel argues that God unites death to his nature. And so when we encounter suffering and death, we taste the particularities of the eternal divine history. As he puts it, this is not a single act, but the eternal divine history. It is not a moment in the economy of the flesh, as St. Cyril would have it, but it is a moment in the nature of God himself. It has taken place in God himself. For Hegel, God suffers eternally in the procession of time. It is an aspect of his eternal nature. Our sin and suffering is necessary for God to be God. Now, this particular Hegelian vision takes on a greater importance in the 20th century in Protestant thinkers like Jürgen Moltmann, who probably does more than anyone else to baptize the Hegelian vision as a Protestant. A Hegelian divine passibility is exposed in Moltmann's book, The Crucified God, which collapses the traditional distinctions between God the Father's eternal, unchangeable, impassible relation to his eternal Son, and the kenotic descent of the Word into the temporary economy of the flesh. For Moltmann, an eternal and impassible divine nature is a Hellenic metaphysical error, which prevents us from seeing that the Father suffers on the cross in the cry of dereliction. Eberhard Jungel, another Protestant theologian, will write books with titles such as God's Being is in Becoming. Post-conciliar Catholic theologians of the Concilium and Communio schools resisted this, but imperfectly. Karl Rahner reaffirms the classical teaching on divine impassibility and denies passibilism, but by collapsing traditional distinctions between the processions and missions and God, or what he calls the interchangeability of the immanent and economic trinity, Rahner comes very close to thinking about a supernatural existential as a quasi-formal aspect of God's being revealed in and through authentic human becoming, which is not quite God's being is in becoming, but it certainly raises questions about whether this could turn our vision of the Father into a mirror of our own experience. Balthasar attempts to outwit the Hegelian collapsing of God into history through the concept of supra-suffering in God, yet at times Balthasar's own treatment of the cry of dereliction in his theology of Holy Saturday sounds similar to Moltmann's eternal rupture in the relation of the Father and the Son. I do not mean to pick on Rahner and Balthasar. They were the finest theologians of a century. But they are examples of a kind of creative rethinking about God's nature that was being done in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. After these heroic theologians passed, after the giants of the initial post-conciliar period retired, there would arise theologians who were not nearly as smart, but now, perhaps for the first time in millennia, described their vision of God less according to the creeds and more according to identity politics. As if looking in a cultural mirror, they might envision God as a woman, or as gay, or as Hispanic, or as a polyamorous therapist. So, over the long run, far too many students are exposed then, in this period, to visions of God very much like what Ludwig Feuerbach said were the only visions of God possible, mainly a mere projection of ourselves, capricious and changeable in the divine nature, just as we can be capricious and changeable in the human nature. In this sense, the passibilist turn, I want to argue, achieved more effectively what the nominalist turn began. A collapsing of the relation with the eternal Father into a relationship with ourselves writ large, narcissism. By contrast, the Chalcedonian vision is one of an eternal, unchangeable, impassible Father who unites human nature to himself in the economy of the flesh, not in order for himself to become himself through our suffering, but to suffer our sins on the cross in order to save us from that suffering due to us by those sins. The Chalcedonian sees the hypostatic union as one which affects not a change in God's nature, but a change in our nature, which affects not a change in God's relationship to us, which is always good and eternally loving, but a change in our relation to the Father, coming to partake in his divine nature through the union with the eternal Word made flesh for a purpose. Seminarians were trained by small armies of theologians, many of them very good, but the contemporary theological trends that I've outlined were inevitably learned, and if not rejected, they informed how a generation gazed at God. Not a few saw the great patristic and medieval theologies as part of a fortress mentality that needed to be reworked and updated because the council had called for openness to the world. But what was to be updated according to what standard? In some cases, it seems that theologians bear some responsibility. My tribe bears some responsibility for understanding or misunderstanding aggiornamento as entailing updating our vision of God according to those philosophies which were more fit for accounts of biological evolution than they were fit to the ancient creeds of the ancient faith handed on once for all. If seminarians are not taught to understand a deeply pro-Nicene vision of God as Trinity or a deeply Chalcedonian vision of how God does and does not suffer in the hypostatic union, students will naturally see the Father differently and can, if not properly inoculated, have a confused and corrupted vision of the Father which comes to them into their gaze by way of contemporary philosophies. The long years dedicated to philosophical and theological formation in seminary must guard against error in our vision of God and his eternal nature. It is ironic that an age which suffered so much looked for a God who cannot wipe away our tears. Secondly, in morals. The metaphysical and theological turn away from the Father has consequences for our understanding of the good life, too. As Benedict already suggests in Regensburg, the nominalist turn put the dictator in the dictatorship of relativism. Once God's intellect and will have become detached, once we see the common good as something like the consensus view rather as that which is ordered to God, once we see in late modern democratic culture that the good can only be known through consensus of a community which decides which counts as good, then no longer do we think well about the good life, either by the precepts of natural law or divine law. Once the harmony of an intelligible world which points to a supremely intelligible God is metaphysically disrupted, it's a matter of time before virtue becomes redefined according to more imminent ends, such as the political community. Catholic moral theology faced challenges like this in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that deserve some reflection as well. In the early 1970s, when my late father studied at a Jesuit university in Seattle, Washington, he encountered priests who taught him, he once told me, situation ethics. For those who don't know, situation ethics was a term of art popularized by a Protestant moral theologian named Joseph Fletcher, whose 1966 book, Situation Ethics, was hotly debated in America on television programs and in universities and in seminaries. It proposed a new ethic of loving concern, but which was little more than utilitarianism. It proposed, Fletcher proposed that if the end of an action is love, that justifies any means to arrive at that loving end. Love is love, which is to say, love as the end of any action can justify lying, premarital sex, adultery, masturbation, sodomy, prostitution, theft, murder, abortion. I'm just reading the things that come through in the book. No act is intrinsically evil, but every act is good or evil depending on the situation and the purpose of the act. If you understand an act as ordered to the end of loving concern, then this justifies the means to that end. If you really love grandma and I know you do, and you want her to feel no pain in the declining years out of loving concern for her. This loving concern justifies euthanasia. The Nazis, of course, were not motivated by loving concern, and so their euthanasia acts were immoral. But if the situation was different, so could the morality of the act be different. If the end is love, then the end justifies the means. Whether the Jesuit priest taught my dad situation ethics to immunize him against such ideas or not, I do not know. I wasn't in the classroom. I was just a glimmer in his eye. I suspect that my father walked away from the course with this concept of situation ethics because the priest was teaching proportionalism. But situation ethics was a phrase more easily grasped by a 20-something-year-old to say something more simply. Whatever my father learned in that class, it was his view that the Catholic Church after the Council was updating how it taught moral theology. He did not know what to think about this, my father. It was neither abhorrent nor attractive to him. I think it puzzled him all his life. He would sometimes raise it cryptically if I raised the topic of Mass attendance. He was a daily Mass goer as a child and rarely went to Mass after college. He still professed a love for God. But I suspect he raised the anecdote cryptically as a kind of justification for diminished participation in the Church. This was not the fault of the moral relativism of situation ethics or his professor's proportionalism. It was his own deliberate fault for not going to Mass. But his sense of upheaval and change in church teaching unquestionably weakened his attachments to the Church. In defense of his teachers, I do not believe they recommended situational ethics. Many post-conciliar Catholic moral theologians newly equipped with the slogan of openness to the world advanced a Catholic alternative to situational ethics, which was relatively better, more rooted in older traditions of casuistry, applying the natural law to cases, not situations. It was an impressive display, this proportionalism of intellectual prowess, marshaling resources from the past, the Stoics, Maximus, Aquinas, to serve as a compromise between moral realism, which sees acts as intrinsically right or wrong, and the antinomian relativistic account, which one sees in Fletcher's situational ethic of loving concern. It was this proportionalism which equipped Catholic moral theologians with new arguments about the Church's moral teaching, updating ancient truths in accord with modern contemporary views. Many were inclined towards this proportionalism prior to the Council, but aggiornamento was taken after the Council to be a battle cry for a new approach. Like the Anglican theologians of the Lambeth Conference in 1931, Catholic theologians were catching up to the Protestant view that moral principles can operate differently in new situations, especially made possible by new technologies. The established principle which favored the procreative end of the sexual act could now be applied in a way which permitted contraceptive technology for the regulation of birth. Catholic moral theologians trained before and after the Council were almost unanimous in their recommendation that birth control may be used to help families plan how many children they want. The Council Fathers had taught none of this. It was not something they took up, but the moral theologians saw it as their responsibility to update Catholic moral teaching in the light of new technology and realities. It was the transformation of moral theology which made a conflict with the magisterium famously inevitable. Paul VI's 1968 reaffirmation of the Church's teaching in Humanae Vitae would cause a hailstorm within the Church in theology departments and seminaries and parishes throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, precisely the time in which we saw a huge surge in heinous sexual crimes committed by some priests, mostly against older boys and young men. It would take the entire pontificate of St. John Paul the Great to reverse the decaying effects of proportionalism with his teachings, such as the 1993 encyclical Veritatis Splendor, doing much of the heavy lifting that rejected proportionalism. The subsequent return to virtue ethics and moral theology has been an academic antidote where it has flourished. By 2002, however, the world knew the terrible consequences of priests who were just as confused as my father about the Church's updating of moral thought. who doubtless found themselves in situations in which they also could justify their behavior by their loving concern. It is in that period of priestly moral formation in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s that we find so much abuse. It is in that period of an ethics of loving concern that we find a surge of illicit sexual activity in seminaries. And it is precisely after Veritatis Splendor in 1993 and after the Dallas Charter of 2002 that we see those cases drop dramatically. But the wounds remain. The moral wounds of ethical relativism are, in fact, I think, father wounds, because they fail to help us think about how our actions are intrinsically ordered or disordered according to God's transcendent goodness, raised high beyond all things. Our moral imagination is brought low to situations and cases, rather than raised up to the intelligibility of the highest good, which is also charity. The priest or bishop who knows best how to handle a situation to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number is not, I would argue, a father. He is a proportionalist. He is a bureaucrat. But more importantly, his own standard is no longer the face of the father. This is clericalism. A world grown weary in its turn away from transcendent being, which has turned away from the highest good, will continually look down to the lowest goods on a scale for its solutions, and they will not heal. In a world turned away from the Father, it is inevitable that the conscience will darken. It will see through a light dimmed all the way down, and it will therefore make the kind of judgments that one would expect from a person who sees God as a dictator, as capricious, or as from a person who gazes at God as a passibilist, emotivist God who shares eternally in our every passion, in our every loving concern, however ordered. Thirdly and finally, the liturgy. Finally, I want to speak sensitively of the third turn away from the Father. This is the most difficult because it will inevitably sound as though I think the Novus Ordo Mass is the problem, when I think no such thing. At the outset, I want to say that the ordinary form and the extraordinary form are one, and they should both be celebrated with the greatest possible reverence for the Lord. In this sense, my reflection in this final part are inspired by Pope Benedict again, but the Summorum Pontificum rather than Regensburg. Liturgical studies for the most of the 20th century and today have been mostly interested in historical excavations which demonstrate the rich diversity of local custom in the Catholic Church. This has been valuable and invaluable, welcome as historical research. However, in the spirit of the liturgy, Ratzinger writes a lament about those liturgical theologians who he says took great liberties with the direction of the Council Fathers at Vatican II. Indeed, the normally reserved and measured Ratzinger seems nowhere more disturbed, more agitated than he is with those liturgical theologians who treated the new order of the Mass as their own invention. He writes of them critically, the fact that the liturgy was presented as a new structure set up against what has been formed in the course of history was now prohibited, and that the liturgy was made to appear in some ways no longer as a living process, but as a product of specialized knowledge and juridical competence, has brought with it some extremely serious damages for us, end quote. And further, he writes, quote, in this way, in fact, the impression has arisen that the liturgy is made, that it is not something that exists before us, something given, but that it depends on our decisions. It follows as a consequence that this decision-making capacity is not recognized only in specialists or in central authority, but that in the final analysis, each community wants to give itself its own liturgy, as if in a mirror. But when the liturgy is something each one makes by himself, then it no longer gives what is its true quality, encounter with the mystery, which is not our product, but our origin and the wellspring of our life. The dictatorship of relativism delights in historicism, liturgical and otherwise, in rupture, liturgical and otherwise, innovation, liturgical and otherwise. Creative fidelity in the liturgy becomes a kind of way of justifying human performance rather than a solemn work of God that transports us mystically to Calvary. Instead, we turn towards one another in positivist horizontal ways, as if to gaze at one another rather than the Father. Perhaps Benedict draws the correlation I'm most after when he simply states the ecclesial crisis in which we find ourselves today depends in great part on the collapse of the liturgy. End quote. As CDF prefect Ratzinger writes in Dominus Jesus 16, the church is not something that invents itself from below. This is what he thinks has happened in certain sectors of the church. The priest, as a kind of performer who infantilizes his congregation, is someone who is creating a culture in which 1,000 private preferences end up being what constitute the life of the church. Removing altar rails, insisting on adversus populum as the church's new form of external worship are mere external signs, obvious examples of a kind of pastoral innovation which had no basis in the Second Vatican II Fathers' teaching, but which was effected from the top down by priests and bishops and lay people alike who thought these changes fit the spirit of the council, which had called for a new kind of openness. In an issue of Novet Vetra, Cardinal Avery Dulles writes that Ratzinger saw liturgical relativism at the heart of the crisis because liturgy presupposes that the heavens have been opened up and that God is coming to his people. Ratzinger argues that liturgical relativism in the post-conciliar period reduced the Mass to the immanent frame in much the way metaphysics gets reduced from thinking about being to thinking about human power and relation. And this brings us full circle back to clericalism and Ted McCarrick. Ted McCarrick was a kind of emblem for the wrong kind of openness to the world. The wrong kind of openness to the world is not so much a problem with what direction the external altars are facing or which direction the priest is turned in relation to the people, but has more to do with the direction of the interior altars of our hearts. McCarrick was the very definition of a worldly priest who had worldly tastes and whose interior altar was undoubtedly turned in upon himself, narcissist performer that he was, whether in the White House or at the beach house. There is a good kind of openness, to be sure. The openness that Vatican II actually called for wasn't an accommodation with the world, but a mission to change it, a mission to illuminate it with the eternal truths that Christ entrusted to the church. The kind of openness that McCarrick represents was different. It was desperate to make and remake the church in the world's image. Now, to anticipate an objection that will surely come from some quarters, these are emphatically not causal claims. It is perfectly possible for a sexual predator to speak well about God, moral truth, and about external forms of worship and still be internally disposed to betrayal. A healthy external vision, taught well, will not simply produce automatically virtue and holiness. But I can guarantee you that a deracinated, emotivist vision of God, a moralism of identity and desire, and a constructivist account of the liturgy will encourage, correlatively, a certain interior disposition that is conducive to caprice and abuse, abusing especially the image of God in us and in others. When we are tempted to see the crisis and its solution solely in political terms, as fixable by means of political rearrangements, review boards, new relations between civil and canon law, we are not actually serious enough about the theological roots of the crisis. These are good things, but they are not enough. When we are tempted to see the crisis and its solution solely in sexual terms, as fixable either by rooting out all deep-seated same-sex attraction or alternatively embracing all same-sex attraction, as resolvable by some change in the celibacy requirement for some or all, or the gender requirement. There are hard discussions to have about these political and sexual issues, but they are more at the root of a dysfunction than they are at the root of the cure. We must see the crisis fundamentally as a turn away from the Father. And so we must understand that any solution to the crisis must attend to how the external forms are best suited to returning all of our interior altars of heart and mind to Him. When young people look back to older metaphysical, moral, and liturgical treasuries of wisdom, they are not being nostalgic. They are looking forward to the Father. They are true progressives who find their way back to the Father. They are longing for patrimony, authentic paternity. They are longing for the face of the Father who has been hidden from their view, obscured by so much sin. If the scandals do not send people far away from the Father in utter despair, which is their diabolical design, then they should send faithful laity, faithful priests, faithful bishops in a different direction, a direction which redoubles their devotion, recasts their openness to change, which does not mean an openness to worldly desire, but an openness to be changed by the face of the Father, to be converted and begin a journey of cleansing, a trek back to our homeland, a disciplined path of return to our Heavenly Father, whose loving and wise face we know in Jesus Christ. Thank you.
Well, thank you to both our presenters for those thought-provoking papers on any number of levels. We'll have time, obviously, for questions and comments from the audience. I'd like to maybe exercise some moderating privilege and ask a question. Certainly your papers have different emphases, looking at the same realities from different perspectives. Without wanting to short-circuit any discussion of differences among you, might I ask each of you if you could single out a point or two from each other's papers that you would most want to second or agree with from that. And so either of you can begin with that question, but a point or two that you would second from the other person's paper.
Yeah, I'm happy to second almost everything in that paper. That very fine. Oh, into the mic. Is it on?
Yes.
Okay. I'm happy to second almost everything in that paper. Different emphases, as you say. I actually don't want to say that there's no reforms that can happen at the level of the political. It's just that that's more symptomatic than it is at the theological roots of the crisis. And so, in a way, I think I can affirm just about everything that Professor Gaillardetz has to say, and then say, but I think somebody with the orange tie from New Orleans was here who asked about what contribution does systematic theology have to offer. I think this is at least a start, a beginning reply to that question that was asked. What kind of contribution does systematic theology have to make? Well, in one sense, I think we actually have to pay attention to how we form seminarians in theological reflection in a way where the theological views fit our worship. And I really do see a lot of the kind of theologian as dissenter. The theologian as dissenter was almost a stereotype of the theologian from the 70s and 80s that was inevitably going to show up in terms of how people were formed. But in no way do I think it's instead of paying attention to political reforms, which Professor Gaillardetz has rightly spoken about.
Thank you. We took such significantly different approaches, so I want to think a little bit about this, and I have tremendous respect for Professor Pecknold's speculative skills and reading of the history of theology. I would probably take issue with certain aspects of it, but I would agree with him that there is a danger of a certain theological sloppiness that has pastoral and ecclesial consequences, and I certainly am in sympathy with at least certain elements of his critique of some moves that have been made in post-conciliar theology. I actually have a considerable sympathy with his concern about a too easy move to embrace divine passibility, which I think is often well-intentioned but has significant negative consequences for the life of the church. And so there certainly are elements of his critique there in terms of kind of disciplined reflection on the doctrine of God that are worthy of our further exploration. I think I'll stop there.
Great questions. Right here.
Yeah, so a question about the stuff that you,
Pardon me.
Oh, sorry.
Everybody, please just briefly introduce yourself and any affiliation you think important.
Dan Burns, I'm a fellow here at the Institute for Human Ecology. A question about the stuff that you almost all agreed on, about the collegiality, the overemphasis on collegiality in the bishops that you criticized in the first paper. I objected to the way that you characterized it as aristocratic. I would prefer courtiers. I think I wouldn't want bishops to be aristocrats either, but in many ways, aristocrats would be a step up. Aristocrats are at least responsible to a local populace that they have some connections to, whereas courtiers are simply dependent on an absolute monarch. If that's true, then my question is, I liked an awful lot a lot of these practical proposals for reform, ending titular sees, ending the shuffling around of bishops, more role of the local diocese in the election of bishops. My question is, how on earth would you ever get Rome to accept any of them? Because generally speaking, absolute monarchs like courtiers and don't like aristocrats.
I'm guessing that was directed a little bit more at me. Yeah. If I could quibble just a little bit, my complaint was not with the notion of collegiality, but with the fact that at the Second Vatican Council, I believe there's a tension between two different forms of collegiality, and that was part of what I was trying to highlight there. And so there's a universalist model that I think is actually more problematic, that which is found in Lumen Gentium 21, than what we would find in 22 and 23. But that gets to be technical. I mean, it's a tremendous task before us, but a Jesuit pope who takes the name Francis seems to believe that he can begin to affect the kind of ecclesial conversion that would be necessary for these kinds of reforms to make sense. And I do think his commitment to synodality is as a creative and yet faithful rereading of the Council's reformist vision has a fighting chance of affecting precisely the kinds of transformations that I'm proposing.
Question in the back.
Hi, I'm Bevel Bramwell, Oblate to Mary Immaculate. I teach at Catholic Distance University. Professor Gaillardetz, you talked about various reforms. Would you have any thoughts about reform in canon law? One cardinal said to me, anything that he tries to do with his priests, they go to Rome immediately and they win. That's just his cynicism, but it points to a problem.
Yeah. Well, did you want to speak to that?
No.
I'm well aware that we have eminent scholars in canon law in the room, so one learns after a while to speak only in fear and trembling in the presence of canonists. Only exceeded by speaking in the presence of biblical scholars, in my view. Not to put too fine a point on it, I think in hindsight, and hindsight is 2020, one of the most unfortunate features of the 1983 Code of Canon Law is that the process of revising the code happened immediately after the close of Vatican II. And I think in hindsight that was a mistake because there had not been sufficient time for the ecclesial intuitions of the council to take root in the life of the church. And so I think the code is excellent in its slavish quotation of the documents of the council and considerably less successful in having internalized some of the deeper ecclesial intuitions that were present at the council. And so without picking on one point or another of the Code of Canon Law, it just seems to me that there were important insights from the council. For example, and I'd like to return to this. This is one of those sneaky things one does when one takes the answer to a question as a chance to respond to one's conversation partner. I think one of the lacunae of the Code of Canon Law, frankly, is that it does not reflect Vatican II's effort to develop a more robust pneumatology. So, for example, a theology of charism is not sufficiently present in the Code of Canon Law. And this will be my opportunity to offer a friendly amendment to Professor Pecknold's characterization of my proposals as political. though I take that from a political theologian to be in some ways a great compliment. I would insist that they were properly ecclesiological and that my own appeal to power is dependent much less on a Foucauldian analysis than a retrieval of a robust pneumatology, a theology of power that needs to be properly appropriated in the life of the church. Now, I suspect you wouldn't disagree with me about a properly theological understanding of power. But sometimes characterizations of these kinds of reforms get dismissed as merely political and can miss, it seems to me, the far more significant ecclesiological import of what we're after here.
A question over on the side, please.
Hi, my name is John Gerbowich, priest from the Diocese of Brooklyn and with the Sales Media Group. First off, thank you so much for a great presentation. I've really liked lots of your work that you put out for many years now, so thank you. It's great hearing you live. I think the thing that brings the synthesis for both you guys is we're really dealing with the crisis that I experience personally as a priest, that I see with my brother priests and with myself, of struggling with what I would call clerical bachelorhood, meaning that there's this idea that, am I really committed to someone, something? Because a lot of times we live lives, and I put myself in this category, where we have lots of things at our disposal. We are able to live a very comfortable life. We don't have to worry about the bills that lay people have to worry about. And yet the other thing too, a bachelor, of course, is not a father. So a bachelor doesn't have to necessarily understand who the Father is, God the Father, nor how to convey the Father's love to the people that he serves. So I think the synthesis for both of you guys is really looking at this idea that's really plaguing the clergy of priests, I think, acting as professional bachelors. And I think that maybe what we could kind of talk about here is, in the seminary, the great irony is that men spend time in the seminary in a semi-cloistered type of environment, but I don't think they're walking away with the art of contemplation for them to contemplate the love of God the Father, that they can in turn be able to reveal that to the people that they were able to see. So this is a crisis of not really understanding, ultimately, the love of God the Father. And I think even people who get very into older traditions, which, whether it's liturgical or philosophical things that they want to revive, I'm not convinced that they're looking at that more as an end rather than a means of coming to know God the Father's love. So maybe you can both address this, because I know both you guys have a thing for Dorothy Day, which I do too, and I know that maybe both of you can kind of maybe also throw her in this mix here too. And I'm also going to tell you too, I have to give a talk on Thursday about Dorothy Day, so I thought that maybe I can just get a lot out of this whole question here. Okay,
Father.
Thank you.
Nice
Peace.
try. Nice try.
Well, I thank you for that comment. I want to just share something personally that has been very important for our family, which is having something very important for our family has been, I won't name him, but some of you may know, we have a priest who has been very important to our family and has been very much a part of our family for Sunday dinners and for a kind of joining our life as a family. And I think there was a time in the church where that was far more common. I think there was a time in the church where priests were very much a part of families. Not like they were showing up for spiritual direction or anything. They were just showing up for a beer or an old-fashioned or what have you. And I think we've lost in the church a kind of gentility. Somebody spoke about aristocracy. We've lost a kind of gentility in which priests are maybe not friends with every family, but there's a family or two that become important to them and that they become a part of. And I really think priests move around a lot, or moved around a lot, but usually local enough that you could sustain relationships with a couple of families. And I don't know how to do this or how to encourage this. Maybe Rick does, but people have proposed having families live in seminaries. I think that's totally unrealistic, and frankly, I couldn't imagine how that would be really conducive to this. But I think there's something more informal that could be encouraged, in which priests actually had real connections with families that weren't conceived as spiritual direction, which weren't conceived as hierarchical, but was conceived about the relationship between the parish and the so-called domestic church. That there could be a kind of fraternity in that could be encouraged and could be a venue of health, and maybe heal some of the breach.
Well, here we should cherish once again another moment of agreement between the two of us. I certainly don't want to put families into the seminaries. You might point out I did mention rather provocatively moving the seminary in some ways closer to the family. So I proposed something admittedly radical and something simply to explore, but what would happen if a greater part of a seminarian's formation were to take place in settings that were far more proximate to parish life and family life? So houses of study attached to a parish where support groups of committed Catholic families might be there to walk with the seminarians, to invite them and introduce them into the rhythms of the domestic church, into the particular moral and spiritual challenges of living the life of the domestic church. So I actually think there's a lot to be said for that situation.
And just a footnote to that, I have a 15-year-old who listens to me and Father talk, and listens to us talk about natural and sacramental fathers and the differences. And I don't know if he has a vocation, but being able to have your children hear those kinds of conversations is very important.
Great. Question in
Shane.
the back, Shane.
Shane Owens, a doctoral candidate here at Catholic University of America. Thank you to both professors. This is a question for both of you because I think there's a kind of common connection here. And I certainly agree. I study Augustine and theology of the episcopacy, which is my research topic, so I think a lot about these questions. But your point, Professor Gaillardi, on the strangeness of the auxiliary bishop being married to a church of, like, you know, some ancient Irish or North African church that no longer exists. And I think that spousal connection is obviously the kind of natural corollary to the paternal analogy that Dr. Pecknold talked about, because you're a spouse to be a father. And so kind of to both of you, because it touches on the spousal and the paternal character of mainly bishops in this case and less priests, the question I'm thinking about is the problem of the Episcopal Conference. Because you spoke about this kind of universalism that thinks of the college kind of as an entity in itself and doesn't think about the spousal or paternal character of the bishop. But it seems like the ability for bishops to push things off onto an Episcopal Conference can undermine their spousal or paternal character, that kind of unit of character. And I like a lot of the practical ways we can talk about this, but that this, you know, the Episcopal Conference undermining the paternal or spousal character of the Episcopal office. So to both of you, thank you.
I agree. This is something that I think is a temptation to sort of behave like a bureaucrat rather than a father or a spouse. I don't know what the solution is.
Well, I want to, I'm going to skip through so let me just, and I don't want to make a big deal of it, I'm probably a little bit more nervous than my colleague about such an exclusive reflection on paternity and so on and so forth. But I don't feel the need to dive into that right now. I want to address the question about Episcopal conferences, which in the realm of ecclesiology is a question that was raised in the wake of the Second Vatican Council and all sorts of concerns about the authority of Episcopal conferences that led to Apostolos Suos, excuse me. And, you know, some of the concerns you raised about Episcopal conferences were raised, of course, in the post-conciliar period. Noted ecclesiologists Henri de Lubac, Hans Urs von Balthasar, then Cardinal Ratzinger, whose own reflection seems to have shifted on this particular point. People tend to overemphasize the shifts in his thought, but I don't think there's much question. He gave a major address at Vatican II supporting a kind of understanding of intermediate embodiments of collegiality or participations in it that I think he walks away from a little bit later. That's an interesting question. To some extent, I'm not unsympathetic to your concerns. One of the classic concerns about relying on Episcopal conferences is that it's overly bureaucratized. When then Father Ratzinger gave his famous address while the council was still in question on collegiality, his appeal was to intermediate exercise of collegiality, in which he was speaking much more of provincial synods and councils. And so one of the things that I think we need to be doing is moving away from overemphasis on bureaucratized entities like Episcopal conferences and a retrieval, as Australia is doing, of the rather untapped provincial, plenary, and provincial councils, which I think are far more helpful for any number of reasons, but not the least of which because canonically there's provision for a greater participation of the entire people of God. So there are ways to affirm mediating levels of collegiality in the life of the church that are less bureaucratized, that would more reflect Pope Francis's call for our church to be more authentically synodal. I actually harbored the hope, to be honest, coming out of the 4-day conference that Pope Francis held with presidents of Episcopal conferences, that he would hold up Australia and say to the presidents, go back to your churches and come up with some mechanism, if it's not a plenary or provincial council, something like that, that is going to allow the people of God to give voice to their profound sense of alienation and so on and so forth, and to create a mechanism that is genuinely synodal. And, you know, his commitment to decentralization, or I would call an ecclesial principle of subsidiarity, makes him reluctant to kind of impose from on top universal solutions. But it would have been nice to have heard him encourage that a little bit more robustly, frankly. That may not be quite what you were talking about, but.
Thank you. I remember that after 2002, a number of American bishops proposed having a plenary council in the U.S., and that went nowhere.
I know.
That was dead on arrival, basically.
Right.
So that's a possible way forward. We've reached time for this session, so please thank Professor Gaillardi and Professor Pecknold for excellent papers and excellent conversation.
Thank you very much.